All right, so good afternoon, everyone, if you are in Brazil or South America, in America in general, and good evening if you are not here in the Americas. I'm Italo Lemos. I'm going to host today's last conference presentation. And this conference is going to be delivered by Hannah Kim. She is an assistant professor at Macalester College. She has received her PhD in philosophy and PhD minor in comparative literature at Stanford, and her master's in philosophical theology at Oxford. She's also an associate editor for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and she writes about fiction as well as music, metaphor, poetry, and Asian philosophy. And she's also interested in philosophy of race, especially multiracialism and existentialism. Her conference is entitled Imagination and the Limits of Fictionality. So Hannah, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It is great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for the generous introduction. I'm gonna share my screen so we can get started there. I assume you'll verbally protest if you can't see. So, yeah, I've been really enjoying the presentations so far. So thank you again to Jerzy and Italo for organizing this. I'm looking forward to the next 2 days as well. So also thank you to the audience for sticking around. I know it's been a long day. So I'll try to keep it dynamic and quick just to keep your energy levels up. So the paper here I'm trying to present, it's pretty new. I mean, I started more or less a couple of weeks ago. So I think feedback of any size or kind would be pretty helpful here. And I'm going to try to go for about 45 minutes to leave the second half of our allotted time for some just community discussion. So that's the goal. So just to give you the conclusion up front here. So what I'm trying to argue is that impossible content can be fictional, which is to say that fictions with contradictory contents can exist. And so my opponents are people who say contradictions can't obtain in fiction, perhaps because they think fictional worlds are possible worlds, right? So if you go with the Lewisian way of cashing out fictional worlds, you're going to think that fictional worlds are possible worlds. So by definition, you can't have impossible things happen. So if you're coming to that view, you might think contradictions just can't obtain, which means that impossible fictions can't exist. And so within that space, I'm trying to argue that at the very least, we can't argue against the viability of impossible fictions on account of our inability to imagine the content. So that's why imagination becomes a key issue in this debate. So I'm mostly going to be talking about contradictions in fiction or impossible fictions. But if I have time, I'm also going to generalize the argument to other kinds of weird fictions. So Nathan Wildman talked about these things called empty fictions, which are fictions in which there are no truths or nothing is true in that fiction, or unlimited fictions, which are fictions where everything is true. So hoping to show that these things are also not problematic insofar as imagination is concerned. So I suppose I'm in the team permissive fiction where I want to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, why not allow all these weird kinds of fictions to exist? So now I'm going to try to convince you of all of this. But before I do that, let me lay out some distinctions first. So when it comes to impossibilities, philosophers make some distinctions. They think there are at least 3 different levels. I think there are some debates about whether these impossibilities collapse into each other or not. Before now, we'll just kind of stick to this basic division that I see place to place. So the most kind of mundane or permissive one is physical impossibility. So talking donkey might be an example, just because donkeys tend not to have the kind of larynx to produce what humans would recognize as speech. Similar with like hyperdrive, space travel, and Star Wars. I looked this up. So apparently hyperdrive involves traveling at a speed of 1,000 light years per hour. It's pretty fast. Definitely not physically possible. Also, if you read about argon that's unstable at room temperature, that is physically impossible, since argon is a noble gas, which is defined as gases that are inert under standard conditions. A little more restrictive than physical impossibilities are metaphysical impossibilities. So I think butterflies that are made of actual butter can't be a thing because the kinds of things that we call a butterfly can't be made of butter. I think a better example might be a t-shirt that is red and green all over. It's impossible for something to be different colors at the same time. And so this feels a little more restrictive than the physical kind. And the most restrictive kind is logical impossibility, which takes a form of P and not P. And so the first example comes from Graham Priest's Sylvan's box story. So if a box is described as filled and not filled, or filled and empty, then that is going to be a logical impossibility. And I think inconsistent time travel is also an example of a logical impossibility, where say within a story, a protagonist goes back and changes the past within a single timeline. And so that would render it such that a past event did and didn't occur. So I think that's a form of P and not P candidate for logical impossibility. So given these distinctions, it's less important that any of these specific examples belong to the category where I slotted them into. And more important is just that you get a sense of the different kinds or different levels. When it comes to fiction, the first two kinds of impossibilities tend not to bother philosophers. So, I mean, we can have talking animals, we can have butterfly made of butter and Alice in Wonderland. Like, philosophers don't get riled up about those kinds of impossibilities, but rather it's the logical impossible kind that gets them all riled up. So when we talk about impossible fictions for the rest of this talk, I'm only talking about fictions with logical contradictions in it. So sometimes it'll be explicitly in the form of P and not P, sometimes it won't, but usually it will be this most restrictive kind that I'm talking about, mostly because that's the kind that philosophers care about. So that's impossibility. There are also two distinctions that need to make within imagination. So there are at least two different kinds of imagination that philosophers talk about. So one is this objectual imagination or an enactment imagination. So if I ask you to imagine the smell of coffee in the morning and you internally conjure up that smell, you're engaging in objectual imagination. So this kind of imagination is phenomenologically rich because it involves you bringing kind of to the forefront of your mind a particular mental state that is sensory in nature. So, you know, those people who can like hold shapes in their minds and rotate them really easily, like those people are skilled in objectual imagination. So it's really rich in this like sensory way. So contrast to that, propositional imagination or suppositional imagination, which doesn't require holding any sensory data in a mind. So propositional imagining just involves imagining that something is the case. So for instance, if I'm reading a short story and I'm told that the capital city of some fictional country is blah, and there's no other description of what that is, I'm holding the belief that the capital city of the fictional country is that thing. So, and there's no other sensory data that is going with that imagination. And so you can see it's more anemic when it comes to sense data. And for that reason, some philosophers say that propositional imagination is not a kind of imagination at all. It's more like just presupposing or supposing. So for instance, it's the kind of thing we use in a reductio proof when you just like assume things. And this will come up later. For now, I will count this as a kind of imagination. But the important conclusion is just that imagination doesn't always involve imaging. So imagination can be phenomenologically lean, and it can be this more propositional form. And that's going to be key in me making a case for impossible fiction. So here is the argument I'm trying to make. Maybe I'll just give you a minute to read it. So sorry about the acronyms. So OI is objectual imagining, PI is propositional imagining. IF on the bottom is impossible fiction. So we'll be taking these in turn. I'm going to try to give you separate arguments for each of these premises. But one kind of disclaimer is you might think just on the outset that if we think that there's no special connection between fiction and imagination, then our inability to imagine something wouldn't count against its ability to be fictional in the first place, right? So I happen to agree with that. I don't think there's a special connection between imagination and fiction, but for the purpose of this paper, I'm adopting the view that imagination is a crucial ingredient in fiction and fictional truth. So think of Walton and Curry's work. I'm going along with that just to show that even if there were a special connection between imagination and fictionality, certain inabilities to imagine something is not going to count against its ability to be fictional. Another disclaimer, if you don't like the term fictional truth, no problem. I just mean fictional content. So whatever is the case according to the story or the fiction is what I mean by fictional truth. I'm just sensitive to this because I've had someone tell me that fictional truth is just as much truth as a snowman is a kind of man. So I was like, okay, I kind of see the point. But anyway, I like the term fictional truth, so I'll use it. But if you don't like it, you can swap it out for fictional content. So back to the argument. I already talked about the first premise, which is just imagination comes in two varieties. So we'll move on to the second one, which is just that worries about impossible fiction or contradictions in fiction are really just worries about objectual imagination. So when philosophers talk about contradictions obtaining in a fiction and they're worried about it, they usually talk about the principle of explosion. So the idea is that if a contradiction can obtain in fiction, then everything would be true in the fiction because of the principle of explosion. Couple quick things to say about this. First, I mentioned Graham Priest's Sylvan's Box already. So that work was written to challenge the idea that contradictions lead to explosions, this very idea, or at least when it comes to our reading experience. So he demonstrates that if we're okay with paraconsistent logic being the logic of the fiction, then like we don't need to always have explosion follow contradiction. And so that might be a debate about what kind of logic is most natural for fictions. But even if fictional worlds are governed by classical logic and there is explosion that follows contradiction, I want to push on this like, wait, but like, why would that be bad for fiction, right? Like, why would it be bad for fictional truth to explode in a matter of speaking? And I think that's where we get to this idea that fiction or fictional truth should give us a sense of what the fictional world is like, which means that I think we think contradictions would be bad even with or without explosion because we just wouldn't know what to make of the story, or we just wouldn't know what kind of story we're dealing with. So if there is explosion, everything is true. There's no beginning or end. There's no plot. There's no discernible character since everything is true. And even without explosion, once you have a contradiction obtained, we just don't know what kind of situation we're dealing with, right? Like you might not even know like how to engage with it in a proper way. So what do you do with a story like that? And so I think that's the most plausible complaint to be had about contradictions in fiction. But I want to impress on you that the issue here now is no longer about what's fictionally true or false, because that bit is clear. The whole problem comes from the box being both filled and not empty, or some other contradiction obtaining, right? And so I think the problem rather is really just that we don't know how to picture the thing we're trying to learn about. Because if you were to take a true and false quiz with Sylvan's Box or some other story where I give you a contradiction where, you know, I'm in a world where it's raining and not raining at the same time, I don't think you would have trouble filling out a true and false quiz about that fiction. Because under the questions, is it raining? And then is it not raining? You're just going to say true to both of them, right? So in some sense, what's fictionally true is not confused or not a problem. The problem kicks in when we're trying to figure out what the phenomenology ought to be that accompanies this fictional truth. And so the point I'm trying to make is that regardless of what logic we think is best for fiction, or regardless of whether contradictions actually lead to explosions or not, I think worries about impossible content has to do with phenomenology or objectual imagination, meaning we just like face this block of like, wait, I don't know how to imagine a box that is empty and not empty. I mean, maybe I'll flicker back and forth, but like, is that the right way? Like, I think it's worries about that, this like reading experience that's making us feel contradictions can't obtain, and not anything about the metaphysical limits of what is fictional. So I'll try to motivate this by pointing to visual fiction and make a case that actually when objectual imagination isn't challenged, then we're totally cool with contradictions. So here's what I call the argument from visual fiction. I think when it comes to the visual medium, we're much more comfortable admitting that there's impossibilia involved. And that tells us really interesting things. So real quick, you might be thinking, wait, why are these fictions? Well, they're fictions because they're representations of non-actual states of affairs without intent to deceive. So I know that's quick, but quick and dirty definition of fiction. The important point is that not all fictions are narratives, and narratives are defined as two or more events that are temporally or causally connected. So we can draw out the chart if you want, but not all fictions are narratives. So a painting or drawing can also be a work of fiction. And so I think the architecture pictures here are examples of two visual fictions. The painting on the left is Escher's waterfall, a physically impossible setup, since water would have to climb up against gravity to fall down on the left side. On the right side, we get the Penrose stair. I think this is metaphysically and even logically impossible. And to show you, I can just say, like, pick a corner that's closest to you. And if you go clockwise, or if you go to the left, you're going to continue to descend until you come back to the place you started. All right, so it becomes a case that you've descended and you haven't descended. So it's a form of P and not P. So this is a logically impossible architecture. What I'm trying to say, I'm curious what kind of pushback there would be against this. It's just that there's an asymmetry when it comes to our engagement with drawings that deal with impossibilia and prose that deal with impossibilia. So when it comes to these drawings, I think we more readily admit that these paintings feature impossible architecture, but people really question whether Sylvan's box really features an impossible object and whether impossible states of affairs can obtain in the fiction at all. And so if I'm right that there's this weird asymmetry in what we're willing to admit as the content of these fictions when it comes to prose versus painting, I think the difference might come from the fact that with drawings, we immediately get a visual sense, even if it's illusory, and I'll come back to the illusion point, we immediately get this visual sense of what these impossibilities are like or would be like, right? So these drawings do the phenomenological work for us. So we don't have to worry about, wait, am I imagining this in the right way? Because we're shown like what this looks like. There's no gap or there's no challenge to objectual imagining. And so I think this is why we don't register trouble with the content, even if we think there's something weird going on. And so the idea is that when it comes to visual mediums, we're more likely to admit that there's a contradiction involved here because the objectual imagining is done for us. It's already kind of laid out. And so this makes me think that a real issue with impossible fiction isn't the contradictory content per se, but it's about our inability to imagine it in some robust way. So you might be thinking, wait, like these drawings are called illusions, right? Like these, we know they're not actual. You're not gonna go find waterfalls that actually look like that or stairs that look like that. And so you might be thinking, Hannah, you're making a big deal about illusions. And I wanna like take that challenge seriously. And so if we think what we just have are illusions and not actual contents of impossibilia, then we wouldn't say that the perceptual content of the thing is impossible and that there's any actual content that's impossible, right? And so a couple of things I want to say to that kind of flavor of pushback here when I give this argument from visual fiction. One is just like, yeah, totally right. So like, let's take the Muller-Lyon illusion, which is A. A is totally an illusion. We certainly wouldn't say that the black parallel lines are of different lengths, let alone say that it's fictionally true that these two black lines are of equal lengths. But I think this is in part because A is not a work of fiction, right? So I think let's look at B, same illusion, but in the context of, I think, a fiction. So when it comes to B, if you agree that this is a tiny written or drawn fiction, I think there is a case to be made that the orange wall on the right is taller than the nearest orange window to the left in this fictional depiction of a house. And so I think B does create the impossible fictional truth that the orange wall is taller than the nearest orange window, even though the non-fictional context of the same illusion wouldn't create that fictional line. And so I just want to make this kind of distinction between, yes, these are illusions, but when couched within a fiction, it can lead to fictional content or fictional truth. And within philosophy of perception, kind of there is this broader open question about what kind of content can be perceived. And so I think there are debates about whether you can actually see an illusion or not. For my purposes, there are some philosophers who think that drawings can depict impossible figures. So Graham Priest is one of them, Alpidoru is one of them, and Jason Leddington recently wrote about this as well. And so open debate, but there are support for the view that we can see an illusion. And I also want to linger on this supposed distinction between us seeing a contradiction because of an illusion and us seeing a contradiction because it's actually represented. So this is Elpidoru's work. He asks, like, can we actually draw a distinction between seeing an apparent contradiction and a real contradiction, right? And that seems kind of weird because there is no real contradiction such that it can exist in reality and we can represent it for real, right? And so any contradiction that we perceive, it's going to be appearance in only, meaning only in representations. So the idea here is that when it comes to the visual case and the prose case, I think it's a misplaced question to ask whether the contradiction is real or merely illusory or apparent. Because when it comes to contradictions, only the representation kind can exist anyway. So I think once we come across them in representation, we should count them as the content of what is actually represented. So the distinction might not make sense. And last thing to say about these visual fictions is just that even if I were to agree that, okay, there's no actual representation of a contradiction, if I were to ask what the intended effect of the drawings were, or what the kind of hinted at contents are, or what like we're trying to like train ourselves to not see because the immediate thing is the illusion, I think we'd admit that impossible architecture or the contradiction is the thing that's involved. That's either intended or that's the thing that's hinted at. That's the thing that we're playing with, right? And so I think that might be already more than what we're willing to give for prose fictions that try to feature impossible objects, because there are a lot of readings of impossible fiction that try to even just explain away any hint of contradiction. So I think when it comes to the visual fictions, even just admitting that it's hinted at or intended at might be more than what we are willing to give to prose fiction. And again, I think that's because with visual mediums, we don't need to do the objectual imagining work, whereas with prose, we do have to do that. So the visual discussions have all been in the service of arguing that our worries about contradictions in fiction are really just about objectual imagining and nothing deeper. So with that, I can move on to show that objectual imagining is not required for fiction or fictional truth. So I think what we're missing at this point is this connection between objectual imaginative inability or fictionality. If we want to say that our ability or inability to robustly picture something is directly related to fiction, a special explanation is owed as to why a block in that particular mental action signals a problem with fictional content. And so to spell that out, I'm going to give you what I'm calling the argument from trivial difficulty. It's just that people fail to imagine fictional content for all sorts of mundane reasons. So for instance, say I'm reading a story and a character is drawing a chiliagon, which is a shape with 1,000 sides. I am not going to be able to precisely imagine what it was that was drawn, right? Like in the story, if I'm asked to zoom into the shapes and the angles of that chili gon, I have no idea what the angles are going to look like, right? Probably close to a circle, but I don't know. But it'd be rash to conclude from that it's not fictionally true that a chiliagon was drawn, right? Similarly, if I don't know my whaling terms, I'm going to read Moby Dick and I'm not going to know what was done with what tools, right? But again, like it'd be really silly to have that be the basis to challenge what is fictionally true in that story. And so these seem like silly examples, but it just drives this point that simple inability to imagine something is not going to lead to us thinking that it can't be fictionally true, right? So there needs to be more. And so what I'm trying to say is that if there are non-problematic cases where objectual imagination can fail, like in the case of the chiliagon or the whaling terms, then we ought to proceed carefully than to just say we can't imagine it as a reason to problematize impossible content. Meaning we need to say more than we can't imagine it when it comes to contradictions in fiction. There's also just the fact that some people read without imagining anything or picturing anything. So one instance of this might be if you're, I don't know if you did this in grade school, but in high school, if you have to read a whole novel in 2 days, sometimes you're just skimming for plot, right? Because you need to be ready for that reading quiz. You're not trying to enjoy the linguistic devices, or you're not even trying to work for symbolism or imagery. Like you're really just extracting content, right? And so that doesn't require you objectually imagining anything. And some people say that that's actually how they read, right? Some people just aren't visual at all. And like, they're not having this play work out in their minds when they read. Rather, it's really just language and words, and they see words in their minds. So that is how some people engage with fictions, but surely we don't want to say that reading for plot or readers without this inner visual experience are failing to grasp what is fictionally true. So you might try to see a distinction between all the example cases I'm giving and the impossible kind. So you might think, wait, but like, what about fictional content that just like can't be imagined in principle? So in the whaling term, I could learn that, I could presumably imagine it. Chiliagon, if I'm like a geometry person, I might be able to, right? So it's not like these things are in principle not imaginable. But what about impossibilia? It seems like in principle, you just can't imagine a square circle because like there is no such thing. Was even mean to accurately imagine a square circle, right? And so I think this is an important pushback, so I want to address it. The basic point is that I don't think this distinction is enough to form a strong connection between robust imaginability and fictional truth. And so here I'll appeal to Walton, right? So Walton says that when it comes to fictional truth, I mean, he doesn't like that lingo. He says what is the case in the story, if you have to talk that way, is it's not what readers in fact imagine, but it's what they're prescribed to imagine, right? So fictions are props that give us this prescription to imagine certain things. And so I think he explicitly admits that sometimes it's possible for a work to prescribe imaginings that just can't be fulfilled. And so that's okay. Readers can't imagine it, but it's still prescribed to them that they imagine that. So that's going to be what fixes fictional content or fictional truth. And so I think a similar story can be told for intention-based accounts like Greg Curry's. They could also admit this non-problematic gap between what the author intends for us to imagine and what we in fact do. And so I think even things that can't be imagined on principle can't be ruled out of fiction because there are resources within imagination-friendly theories of fiction to accommodate that. And so I think it's still like worth asking where this intuition comes from, or like do a bit of error theory. So like in the end, like why is it that we put such a premium on our ability to objectively imagine fictional content if it's not crucial for making something fictional anyway, right? So I want to like get some psychological answer to this, and I think there might be a an answer that has to do with transportation or immersion. So these are the studies on the bottom that I read. So these studies suggest that our recognition of fictional truth is closely connected to transportation, which is a high level of immersion in the fictional world. So the idea is that transportation, or like being in the fictional world, makes it less likely for readers to experience imaginative blocks, or like when they're transported, they're going to have less issues just even believing weird fictional truths, including contradictions. And I think this is because they've already put in the work of being a visitor in the fictional world. So it's relatively less work to pick up weird truths because you're like already there. So the more we mentally picture a narrative, the more correctly and quickly we pick up fictional content, even weird ones. So that seems to be the study. And so according to like this transportation idea, robust imagining is involved with immersion, which helps with fictional content uptake. So I think that might be why we think objectual imagining is key to fictional truth. But again, the fact that particular mental actions help with fictional content cognition doesn't lead to the conclusion that fictional content is generated or determined by that mental action, namely our imagining it. So I'll say more about this shortly. So to take a quick recap, here's a summary of what I've been driving at so far in slogan form. The inability to objectively imagine X does not mean, or it is not the same thing as inability for X to be fictional. These things come apart. And so now I want to move on to what's actually sufficient for fictional truth. And I hope to show that propositional imagination is sufficient for fictional content, fictional truth. So this has already been argued. So for instance, Peter Cohn argued that propositional imagination is enough for fictional content because propositional imagining, which involves imagining that something is the case, helps us mentally keep track of what's true according to the story without robustly picturing anything. So most philosophers agree that mental imagery is not necessary for imagination in general. So Walton and Yablo wrote about this, among others. So I think prima facie, it makes sense that propositional imagining might be enough to render something fictionally true or explain our engagement with fiction. The propositional imagination already lets us build a mental model of what's true in the fictional story. And so that's just what's necessary. It might be that objectual imagining is nice because it enriches our experience, but I don't think it's necessary. Of course, there's disagreement about whether propositional imagining is sufficient. So Amy Kind, for instance, argues that propositional imagining might not be a kind of imagination at all because it's just too thin a notion. I mean, it's more like presupposing because you're just entertaining a proposition in your mind. It's a really kind of weak kind of mental action. So she says philosophers aren't clear on what precisely more is required to count as imagining and not merely presupposing, but they do think that imagining is more robust, it requires more active engagement than merely supposing, right? So the idea is that propositional imagining is just too kind of ghostly a notion to count as real imagining. So that's one thing, the one worry, that propositional imagining is not imagination at all. But I think there's a more serious worry for us for the purpose of fiction. It's just that because propositional imagining is so thin, it can't explain how we actually engage with fiction, more particularly why we feel emotions when we're engaging with fiction. So in order to explain why we get angry or sad or happy while engaging with fiction, we need to explain or we need to think that there's something a little more active and involved going on than merely supposing things. And so that's where propositional imagination is seen as deficient and explaining how affect is generated. So it's too weak to explain our engagement with fiction. And to that, I think there's at least 3 responses we can give. One is just that, look, totally fine if propositional imagination is not imagination after all, right? So like, even if it's more like presupposing or entertaining. I'm saying whatever we want to call it or categorize it as, it's still enough to give us an explanation for why we emotionally react to fiction, meaning like it's good enough for fiction. And so I think this is because presupposing or even just entertaining things does lead to affect, both directly and indirectly. So, and I'm drawing from Arcangeli's work here. So, I mean, I'll just give you some examples. Apologies for the examples that are to follow. So suppose or entertain that after this talk, you go to the kitchen and you find a cat eviscerated, right? Or like you find a cat that's disemboweled, right? Like, it's a shame I can't see your faces, but like I imagine some of you have made a face, right? And so like, or imagine that you're a parent, or not, sorry, don't imagine it, only presuppose or just entertain that you're a parent and that your children are sick. And you're trying to use that entertainment or presupposition to try to decide what kind of health insurance you should give, or at least in the US, that's like a big deal. So these examples are just meant to show that even if you're just told to entertain or presuppose, a lot of times you just holding these propositions in mind are going to lead to imagination. You might have like involuntarily pictured some things, and that's going to lead to emotional responses. And so in that way, merely presupposing or merely entertaining does indirectly cause or accounts for affect. And it might be more roundabout, right? Where you first get entertainment, presupposing, and then imagining, and then affect. But the point is that there is this kind of route we can take from merely presupposing or entertaining to affect, and that could explain our engagement with fiction. And the second thing, and I think this is the point I'm more excited about, is just to say that the kind of mental model building as a result of propositional imagination or presupposing that goes into trying to figure out what's fictionally true within the story, like that whole mental thing is separate from this more robust, non-propositional, emotionally laden, objectual imagining that tends to make us feel emotionally towards fiction. So in other words, what makes it something fictionally true and what makes us emotionally react to fiction may not be the same process or even same mental action. So I think I can refer to Walton again to try to kind of motivate this case. So Walton's theory of fictional truth says that it's the prescription to imagine that determines what's fictional. So that's the mental action, or that's like the fact that grounds fictional truth or fictional content. But then we'd say that it's what we in fact imagine that leads to affect, right? So we just kind of see these two things come apart, like the grounding for fictional truth and the grounding for emotional reaction are two different things. So even if propositional imagining isn't robust enough to explain our affective reaction to works of fiction, the fact that what grounds fictional truth and what grounds our emotional reactions gives us enough wiggle room to acknowledge that propositional imagining, being kind of lean, phenomenologically speaking, doesn't necessarily pose a problem for the kind of emotional affect we tend to feel towards fiction. So that's the second response. And then the last response I think we can have is, and this is pretty new work I'm drawing on too, which is just that propositional imagining can be a skill that we can develop. So Amy Kind argues that we tend to think and act as if individuals vary in their imaginative capacities. And she thinks it's a shame that our talk about imagination just hasn't reflected this insight or intuition that we have. And so maybe our collective, or maybe some of us, our inability to imagine contradiction is something that we can overcome with practice. That seems to be the suggestion. But I have a lot of questions around this kind of idea of propositional imagining being a skill to improve. Because with objectual imagining, I think you can think more of it as a skill that you can practice and improve on, right? So you can try to rotate shapes in your mind in different angles and do it over and over again until you get the nuances right. But when it comes to propositional imagining, what does it mean to be good at it? And what does it mean to even accurately propositionally imagine something? The best I got so far is just one skill in propositional imagining might have to be spelled out dispositionally, where it's something like you propositionally imagine X well if you have the disposition to like reason accordingly to X or something. But I'm not sure about this. So if there are any thoughts about this, I'd especially welcome it during Q&A. But now here's my last argument for why I think we should allow impossible fictions to be possible. It's an argument from revisionist interpretation, which is not quite an argument. I guess it's more of a plea, but I'll call it an argument. It's just that I wish we wouldn't engage in revisionist interpretations of artworks where we don't need to. So what do I mean? Well, when a philosopher says that impossible fictions can't exist, someone might offer a kind of Morean response, right? Be like, wait, what do you mean I can't imagine contradictions? Don't tell me what I can and can't imagine. I imagine 3 contradictions, like even while just listening to your talk, right? And so it's kind of a Morean response. And at that point, some skeptical philosophers of fiction will pull the move that I call the well, actually move. So against the Morean skeptic, they might say, well, like you might think you're imagining a contradiction, but what you're actually doing is meta imagining, right? So you might think that you squared a circle in your imagination, but really what you imagined is you getting famous as a result, or you playing with shapes, right? Or you doing interviews. So people try to explain away what it is that people actually have imagined when they report that they imagined something funky. And so meta imagining is one move, but this kind of well, actually explanation is one that is not unpopular. And I just get a little worried about it. So to be clear, I'm not saying that people can't be wrong about what they think they're imagining, right? I'm not saying that. Surely we can think of cases where, I don't know, if I don't know the difference between an alligator and a crocodile, I might think I'm imagining one, but it's actually the other. Like, yeah, people are mistaken sometimes. But I also equally get nervous if our default stance if our default stance is just us feeling super comfortable, like pulling this well actually move, or if we're just really okay with constantly explaining to others what is in fact they're imagining. Like something about that just seems unideal. So that's why it's less of an argument and more of like, hey, wouldn't it be nice if our theory didn't make us do this? Right? So, I mean, more concretely, this kind of well actually attitude makes philosophers offer really radical reinterpretations of works. So I can point to some fiction examples here. So in Time and Fiction, which is a work by Craig Bourne and Emily Caddick-Bourne, they're really committed to this idea that fictional worlds are possible worlds, right? So they are against impossible things obtaining in fiction. And so to make sense of this, they offer radical reinterpretations of beloved fictional works, including Groundhog Day, right? So to explain away the contradictions of Phil having lived the same day over and over again, they end up arguing that in Groundhog Day, Phil actually doesn't live the same day over and over. And instead, what we see are snippets of different possible worlds of Phil counterparts. And we just witness Phil in different possible worlds each day. And so that lets them have an interpretation of that work where the work doesn't commit the viewer to metaphysically impossible states of affairs. I think this kind of revisionist interpretation is unideal. So one, I mean, not only does it like go against really popular received interpretations of the work, but I think it actually violates the spirit of the work. So it's an aesthetic defect to do this that are driven by our metaphysical commitments, because the entire premise of Groundhog Day is that Phil becomes a better human being throughout all the repeated days. And the spell or the curse of the repetition is only broken when he becomes a good enough person to deserve Rita's love. Like there's a whole like arc to it that's aesthetic. that just isn't there anymore once you explain away the repetition. And so that violates the kind of the explanatory force of the whole plot or narrative. And so if it isn't fictionally true that Phil lives through the same day over and over again, not only the comedic effect, but also the explanation for his transformation becomes null. And I think that's an aesthetic harm to the work. And that's just one example, but I worry that if we get comfortable offering these revisionist interpretations in line with like possibility, then we're going to do harm to some of these works. And so relatedly, that had to do with not doing harm to works. I also worry that we would be doing harm to creators if we are bound to this idea that fictions can only operate within possibilia. So the idea is that we shouldn't wholesale discount the creative intentions of fiction creators by trying to explain away all contradictory content on principle. So like, say I'm a fiction writer and I'm trying to set out to write a short story. And, you know, I write a story about a philosopher landing in London. I step out of the arrivals door and I see that it's raining and not raining. And I think to myself, this is what the UK is like nowadays, right? Like, if you're telling me that I can't write that kind of story because contradictions can't obtain, like, you're just like taking away from my creative power, and you're just de facto overriding my intentions. And again, as a philosopher, I think it is good for philosophers to have some kind of right to correct people or clarify things when people are confused. But at the same time, I feel uncomfortable when philosophers feel super cool with just telling everyone else what they can and can't do because of our metaphysics. So again, I'm not saying that philosophers can't or shouldn't correct people when they're in error, but wouldn't it be nice if our theory of fictional truth didn't require us going around while actually in people or just bulldozing over creative intents? That's kind of my less of an argument and more of a consideration I put forth. And so I want to begin to wrap up here. And I'm just going to briefly extend all of this discussion to the other kinds of weird fictions that I mentioned, which is unlimited fiction and empty fiction. And so I hopefully have shown that impossible fiction is fine because we got propositional imagining to do the work that we need for fictional truth. Unlimited fiction is a fiction in which every proposition is true. And so Nathan Wildman says it's pretty easy to write one. You just need to have a contradiction obtain in a story governed by classical logic, and the principle of explosion will take care of it, right? Like, it will give you a fictional world in which everything is true. We have an example of it. It can exist. There's been some pushbacks on this. So Michelle Ignace replies that readers don't actually take contradictions at face value when they come across the work, because instead they take it as a cue to engage with the work in some particular manner. So for instance, they might think there's something metafictionally playful going on when they see contradictions. And so they don't just interpret that as what's actually true in the story. And he also complains that logical contradictions are mostly confined to what he calls pictions, so fiction, but with like a PH, beginning, which are short stories that philosophers concoct for the sake of advancing some argument. So he thinks there are a lack of genuine examples from the wild that include contradictions, which would give rise to unlimited fictions. But I want to say that Ignace's points actually don't have to do with what can or can't be fictional, meaning his pushbacks don't have to do with the limits of fictional content, but rather the difficulties he points to has to do with the difficulty of creating a particular work that would have unlimited truths, or the difficulty of getting the reader to actually interpret the work or engage with the work in a way where they take contradictions at face value. And so that's one worry about unlimited fiction that I think is more about the work or readership than fictional content per se. But I think there's another way we might think unlimited fictions couldn't exist, and it's just that there's no beginning or end, right? Like, we would usually, when we read a story, we would like to get a sense of what a fictional what that given fictional world is like. And so this unlimited fiction seems weird. But I think this is where we bring in the objectual imagination worry again. I think this kind of worry focuses on the fictional world's picturability. And so the trouble doesn't get in the way of our recognizing that everything in the world would be true. So again, if you're given a true and false quiz about it, you're just going to write T on all of them and pass no problem. But resistance against unlimited fiction is similar to resistance against impossible fiction, where the worries about objectual imagining and readerly experience than the limits of fictional content per se. And so for all these same reasons, I think empty fictions are totally cool too, which is fictions in which nothing is true. So empty fiction can exist. So two examples I could think of. One is that imagine a work like Clockwork Orange, where all the words are made up. So lots of neologism going on. But imagine the made up language is just so complicated, you can't figure out what the words mean, even with repeated exposure. And so it's just a seemingly grammatically correct work where you can't figure out the semantics of anything. I think that might be a work, an empty fiction, where a fiction in which nothing is true because you just can't make sense of it. They're also just straight up empty literary works, which is texts that consist of exactly 0 words, letters, or symbols. So Ben Blumson has an example called Meta Microfiction from 2012. There's also a work called Suburbia, which is a novel that includes title and copyrights and dedication, table of contents, introduction, footnotes, index, even a list of errata, but it lacks any body of text, right? So it's kind of cheeky, but there are examples of 0-length literary works. So these works are literally just don't have any content, so nothing is fictionally true. But at the same time, it doesn't mean empty fiction needs to be empty literally. It just means that nothing is confirmed as true, which is why extremely unreliable narrators where you can't figure out what's true, or the Clockwork Orange, but harder examples would also count as an example of this. So again, agreed that the phenomenology might be weird with empty fictions, right? What do you mean nothing is true? Like, what do we do with that, right? But readers are free to imagine whatever they like, as long as they understand that nothing is actually fictionally the case, right? So this is another instance in which what's fictionally true comes apart from what we actually do while we're reading with the work. And we can imagine all sorts of things. So imagination that accompanies fictional engagement doesn't necessarily need to cohere with what's ultimately fictionally true. Oh, wow. So I think that's it. I hope to have convinced you that we can be permissive about the kinds of fictions that can exist. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Awesome. So thank you very much, Hannah, for your excellent presentation. And now we have time for questions. As usual, you can make a question by going down here on Zoom. There are reactions, and then you can use the device raise hand. Excellent. So Sam.
Hey, that was great. Thanks so much. You mentioned the Bourne book where they kind of get in on this issue. I was just wondering if you'd say a little bit more about who you kind of have in mind as the folks who are really pushing back on the possibility of impossible fictions, in part just because I'm super curious about, and it's not hard to warm up to the idea that they just have to be impossible fictions given sort of preface style paradoxes, views people have about certain theological commitments, et cetera. But I was wondering if it was sort of like, is the idea a kind of, I can only understand fiction qua an alternative to reality? So just anything you could sort of say. You did a really great job sort of walking through the kind of phenomenological argument, but I'm wondering if there's just other arguments in the offing that would be useful to talk about.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I only share that my opponents tend to be motivated by the possible world framework of fictional worlds. So if you go the David Lewis route of trying to think of, fictional worlds are just possible worlds, that just kind of rules out impossibility as the kind of thing that can be the content of a work. So I think that might be the biggest motivation for the opponent. There are also some overlaps here with the literature and imaginative resistance, where people think morally deviant claims or mathematically deviant claims are just not the kinds of things we tend to imagine, and different ways to spell out what exactly is going on there. But I think some people think that certain truths are just necessary, which means that anything that contradicts that can't be fictional. And so I think some people might think classical logic might be one of them, or contradiction that I'm obtaining might be one of them. So that's also one motivation for the opponent. So yeah, those are the ones on top of my head right now of why someone might be bothered to push back against contradictions genuinely obtaining in fiction.
Cool. Just super small thing. Just it might be worth talking a little bit more just about the case of like truth value gaps as the sort of other species of impossible fictions, but they're just the ones we don't tend to worry about, right? Just insofar as if you believe that reality is essentially maximally determinate, for example, then any fiction you've got where there's truth value gaps is just going to be an impossibilium, but not the kind that is sort of spicy because it's not going to involve kind of contradictions. So it seems like there's talk about impossible fictions versus contradictory fictions, and just interesting results different ways.
Yeah, sorry, could I just clarify that really quick? So are you saying that because fictional worlds tend to be incomplete in ways that fiction, in ways reality isn't, we already admit that fictional world is kind of weird? Why not just kind of like use that as a
opening? If you did have this view where you thought reality was essentially determinate, and then you were in on certain fictions that were admitted of truth value gaps, obviously there's puzzles, right? Because according to most fictions, they end up being determinate too. It's just not the case that it's kind of like a second order determinacy. But that's another way for a world to be impossible. It's just much less glamorous than a contradictory world.
I see. Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Awesome. So Nat.
Thanks. And thanks, Hannah. This was marvelous. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, do you think there's a difference phenomenologically or epistemologically or otherwise between intentional and unintentional logical contradictions? So Lewis's famous example of Conan Doyle puts Watson's war wound in two different places, and Tolkien has examples in Lord of the Rings where two characters couldn't have seen the same, I think, the moon at the same time, versus things like Groundhog's Day, or maybe there's some magic systems where we're supposed to understand logical contradictions, or maybe even, shout out to Meryl, maybe even breaking the fourth wall counts as a logical contradiction. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, good. So for my purposes, I'm just counting them all as contradictions mostly because I'm trying to resist the move that my opponents make, which is make this distinction and then argue when it comes to mistakes, like the Conan Doyle examples, like the shoulder or leg war wound, we're just going to explain that away as this is not a real contradiction. Like there's no aesthetic loss if we just write that off as a mistake. So they're going to ignore cases like that. And then when it comes to contradictions that are actually at the heart of a story, so priests, Sylvan's box is one of them, where you can't explain the narrator's bafflement if we learn that the box isn't actually weird, right? So it's at the heart of the story that there's something weird going on. Similar with, I think, Groundhog Day. In those cases, they have to like do the work of explaining it away or doing some fancy footwork. So from my opponent's point of view, that's the distinction because the strategies are different. I think for my purposes, I'm like, let them both occur. Like, what's the problem? But maybe I can also kind of write off the mistake cases because they're not crucial to the work.
Okay, thank you.
Nice. So Alex.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks so much. This was really cool. I had thoughts on the learning from fiction stuff that I wanted to ask you about. Sorry, not learning from fiction. Imagination as a skill and learning to imagine almost. Because I kind of agree that it like makes more sense for objectual imagining, where it's like you can kind of do it better. Whereas with propositional imagining, it seems kind of all or nothing. Either you can do it or you can't. But I was wondering whether imaginative resistance might actually offer a case of learning to propositionally imagine. Like, so certain propositions, like I might immediately face imaginative resistance to. So like one example is, so as you said, like morally deviant truths, like eating babies is good or something, might be like, oh, I can't imagine that. But then like maybe someone gives me like more context or something like that. They say, oh, well, imagine a world in which this happened and eating babies solves solves global hunger or something like that, right? And then suddenly I'm like, okay, so I can imagine that now. And so even if it's all or nothing, do you think you can still, is that still learning, like as like a skill where you're kind of developing it, overcoming this resistance? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I like that you're pointing to imaginative resistance, because it seems like, yeah, a block in a propositional imagining. Like we don't even need to picture it. We just don't want to admit that here's a fiction where it's true that eating babies is good, right? So yeah, I think that's right. Where like, if we learn to be the kind of people who can like imagine some backstories or imagine some context in which the propositionally imagined content is true, that should count as you improving your ability to propositionally imagine it. And there's actually empirical backing for this, which is why I'm excited about the example. So I think Sheni Lau and company had a example of like child sacrifice in the context of two different kind of settings, one like 21st century police drama, another one like magical realism in like 15th century Aztec setting. And they said that readers had less trouble thinking it's fictionally true in the Aztec story that child sacrifice is okay, just because, I don't know, the religious rules are different there, right? So that seems like a context in which, the setting or the context of the story determines our ability to propositionally imagine it or not. Although people disagree here, and that's the thing about imaginative resistance, when people say, is it your inability or is it your like unwillingness to imagine? And so let's just say it's still like your inability, because people say they can't. So I don't know. I tend to be like skeptical of imaginative resistance, because I'm like, what do you mean you can't imagine it? Like, just try harder. So I'd be really curious if you're one of those people who can't imagine a world where eating babies is good. I really want to hear more about what you mean. But yeah, I think context imagining might be a good kind of way to train yourself to be better. Yeah.
All right, cool. Alberto?
Yes, thanks a lot, Anna. It was really interesting and stimulating. And mostly I agree with everything what you said. So it's just a way of stressing maybe your point further. That is, if I got you right, for you the idea is not that one has to stick to the claim that propositional imagining is transparent. We can accept the idea that imaginers, so to speak, may have no first-person authority with respect to their imagination. But still, if we did not allow for sometimes propositional imaginings be contradictory, we could not explain the kind of functional role that such imaginings actually play. For instance, I give you the example. Suppose that one imagines the story of someone who were able to square the circle. And then, in virtue of having imagined this story, he or she thinks that this guy should be given the Nobel Prize. And the reason why one has this sort of thought is precisely because he or she had that sort of contradictory imagination. For otherwise, if the content were different, this would not be explainable, so to speak. Because one should not have this sort of functionality, independently of whether one has a sort of transparent access to one's content, so to speak. What do you think of this line of reasoning?
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. Like, we want to maintain our kind of intuitive reading of these artworks, where at the heart of them are these weird contradiction cases. So yeah, I agree that that should take precedent, but I could imagine a philosopher being worried that here's a choice we have to make between like aesthetic integrity of these stories that might be philosophically underinformed or wonky versus having like a solid metaphysical understanding of fiction. and given like, well, first, is that even like a fair a trade-off to pose? And second, if that is a fair trade-off, how do we choose and why? So I guess that's kind of the follow-up worry, where I agree that some stories really commit us to thinking that contradictions can obtain, and it's at the heart of the problem, and we need that for proper aesthetic engagement. But if we think that's metaphysically problematic, what's going to go, the art or the metaphysics? And I don't have a principled way of answering that. Do you? I don't know.
Thank you.
Awesome. Now we have Julia.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks very much for your presentation. I found it to be incredibly insightful and interesting. I have some more targeted questions about logical impossibility in fiction. There's something fundamental I'm just not grasping and would appreciate your thoughts, namely with respect to premise 2A. So you've addressed this, to a degree already, namely with respect to impossible architecture. And I agree with respect to with logical impossibility that it's relatively incontrovertible to characterize a contradiction as not as P and not P. But when I think of something like a round square, I personally think that to be a kind of logical contradiction in a Euclidean sense. But surely there's, say, like a Tarskian model wherein this is false, a model wherein a round square is conceivable. And let's suppose there's a counterexample which would suggest that this is not a contradiction. So I guess my question boils down to this. Well, I guess a robust definition of what counts as logically true needs to hold in all possible models, and it must have significant modal and formal force. So sorry, my question is, how do we define the parameters of what counts as a contradiction? And how does it differ from our understanding of logical impossibility or in reality or truth in the actual world?
Yeah, hard question. Let me start with saying that, isn't there a way to understand a square? Oh, I thought that's what you're getting with the Tarski stuff. I was going to say there's a way to understand a square circle such that it is P and not P in the form, but maybe not. I'm tempted to just say, look, possibilities that seem more, impossibilities that seem more demanding to our imagination maybe, or our logic, than metaphysical impossibility is the kind of thing I have in mind. And however you want to spell that out, I'm saying they're all cool in fiction. Is that too much of a cop-out of an answer?
No. I completely agree with you, because it's just, when I think of something that's logically necessary, I think of it as something that's, according to the Tarskian criteria, maximally invariant and formally true. So, and I'd feel as though that in order for impossible fiction to be permissible and to have it would have to adhere to those, cohere to those kind of criteria. I think that's what I have in mind, but I'm also myself a bit stuck. So.
Yeah, but I think you're pointing to this important thing I need to do, which is, wait, do I need to take a stance on what kind of logic is best when it comes to explaining our fictional world or fictional engagement, or are there just choices that we can make? And here are the upshots. I just haven't done that work yet, and I ought to, and that's what I'm taking away from this discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome. So anyone else would like to raise a question? Oh, Nat.
Hi, thanks. Hannah, a silly terminological question, and then maybe a more serious one that Julia just made me think of. So the silly terminological question is, I have no problem with the phrase fictional truth. And in fact, I've used a similar, or I guess I've used the contrapositive phrase, the converse phrase, incorrect fact, in some of my own writing. So when I try to describe what our friend Urbain Barrier was doing when he says Vulcan explains the perturbation in Mercury's orbit, he was stating a fact. He was just stating an incorrect one. the silly terminological question is, do you have any qualms with flipping it and talking about factual falsehoods or incorrect facts? Or is that all just par for the course?
So my ongoing worry with fictional truth, especially when it comes to introducing the concept to non-philosophers, is how dangerously close it feels to fake news or alternative facts, especially. So my worry is that factual falsehood sounds more similar to alternative facts than fictional truth does. So that would be my only immediate worry. Yeah.
That's it. That's interesting. I actually, and nobody except for myself seems to like phrase, but I came upon it precisely to define conceptual space opposite from alternative fact, because there are no alternative facts. Facts are either true or false. But I was just wondering. I don't know if you have a response to that. Then I sort of have the somewhat more substantive question.
Yeah. I guess I want to hear more about the thought behind factual falsehood. Like, was there some motivation about wanting to get away from fiction?
Yeah, because I guess like Alex's paper, I really don't want to say that the entire history of science is nothing but a body of fiction. And I also don't want to say, given pessimistic induction worries, that all of current science is just a body of fiction. I'd like to say that science is factual, just some of the facts turn out to be correct and some turn out to be incorrect. But then for most people, that's nails on a chalkboard.
Yeah, I guess I agree. And I think it's just weird to think, like, it's a weird kind of literalist application of what fiction is, to think all bodies of past science is fiction. We're just trying to think, yeah, it's a falsehood. They didn't mean to
but if you see what I
trick
mean,
anyone, right? But I feel no, fiction is also an institution. Like, it's a practice that are bound by certain rules. And it's
I also think, relatedly, this is not the substantive question, but relatedly, I also think there can be fictional falsehoods. So, right. So it's just false that Watson was smarter than Holmes.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
But anyway, when you were talking about what do you need a logic to undergird your theory of fiction, people who work in more in literature, I think, sometimes talk about narrative logic, which is not going to be propositional classical logic or truth functional logic. And in a way, you're not in a way. I think precisely your example of Groundhog's Day is that the narrative logic requires the classical logical contradiction. So is that one way of framing your argument, that maybe in the non-mistaken cases, narrative logic trumps whatever we're calling it, binary Tarskian Boolean logic?
Yeah, maybe I'm saying that whatever kind of philosophical logic, symbolic logic we want to get, we need to get out of narrative logic. So we need to figure out what the needs are given the kind of narrative sense we need to make of the story, and then see, okay, what system of logic would help us get all the right fictional truths. So it might be that this can differ from fiction to fiction. Like, some classical logic's just fine. Some we need pair consistency. Some we might something else. But yeah, no, that might be a good way to put it. The narrative logic takes precedent, and then we get the symbolic logic after that. But this kind of gets us back to the worry I was mentioning to Alberto. Is this a case of choosing between aesthetic integrity and, like, I don't know, logical or metaphysical robustness? And I would want to resist that way of trading off, but if it is put, how do we decide and why? Maybe that's like a meta-philosophical question, but I feel the force of that.
No, thank you. If I can have just one quick follow-up, just as an example. So I've done some co-authoring with someone whose background is in literature, and when I run fictions with a PH by him, that is philosophical thought experiments, his initial reaction is often things like, yeah, but that would never happen in a story. So if you see what I mean, there is tension, and maybe, as you put it, between aesthetic and Boolean or something like that.
Yeah.
So I can give you even to make it concrete. So Donald Davidson has this thought experiment about the swamp man he's a doppelganger of Davidson himself, who seems to speak, but according to the thought experiment, doesn't actually. He just makes noises that are homophonically identical with ones that Davidson would make. And my co-author would say, yeah, but that would never happen in a story. Like the guy, Davidson just wouldn't evaporate, because according to the thought experiment, he does. So that's just to make concrete that there is a kind of logic going on. So maybe I'm even going to push back and say that we do have logically possible worlds. They're just narratively possible. It's a different kind of logic governing it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And this is reminding me of just like a kind of long-standing question or issue I have in my mind of like, I don't know, what kind of effort ought we make to connect our discussions to other folks who talk about fiction or think about fiction. So literary theorists are like one camp that I have in mind. Creative writers are also one. But like for a long time, I used to think like, no, but they're not philosophers. They're not being careful and thoughtful about what they're doing. So like, who cares what they think? But I was like, wait, this is kind of problematic. It's kind of like philosophers of science just ignoring scientists. And like, I don't know, maybe they do. I'm not sure. But like, something seems unideal about that. So I don't know, like you all work on or thought about fiction a lot. Like if you have thoughts on like what our relationships ought to be to other fiction theorists or thinkers, and how to like bridge that gap. Like I think about that a lot, because whenever I try to talk to non-philosophers about any of the fiction stuff I do, like they're like interested in it for like 20 seconds and then like they moved on, right? So I'm like, wait, like am I doing this poorly or like what's going on?
Well, for what it's worth, I think your work on imagination is a fantastic bridge between the disciplines. And one criticism that literary theorists have about, I think, philosophical thought experiments is we do a thought experiment in 5 sentences, and they will do a thought experiment in a 1,000-page novel, because we're appealing in different ways or to different degrees to imagination or not to imagination. But thank you. I feel like I've filibustered enough.
Awesome. So any questions? Excellent. So that's it for today. I would like to thank Meryl Semaine, Paulo Barroso, and Alex Fisher for their excellent presentations, and also Professor Roberto Voltolini and Professor Hannah Kin for their excellent conferences. I think it was an excellent first day for the Colloquium. I'm really excited to see what's coming ahead of us in the next 2 days. And tomorrow at 10 a.m. GMT-3 here in Brazil, we have another conference that's going to be delivered by Professor Frederik Haraldsen. That's going to be entitled, let me see, Fiction as Possibilities. Right. So thank you very much for all of you for being here, for accepting our invitation.